So as mentioned before, my name's Eleanor Clayton. I am the curator of the Stanley Spencer exhibition upstairs. And I'm going to talk about Spencer this afternoon. And my paper really comes from two things that happened to me. Firstly, reading Lucy's essay that Simon mentioned before, and what I was particularly struck by was how knowledge of Hepworth's beliefs, as I'm sure we'll see later in Lucy's paper, gave me a different reading or a different interpretation of the forms within her work. And that was what I found particularly interesting about it, rather than the subject matter. And then the other thing was my mum saying, when I said I was working on a Spencer show, that she liked some of his work, but given that he was obviously such a good painter of certain portraits and landscapes, why did he make some of his figures look so odd? And so this was my kind of, attempt to answer that question by looking at Spencer's religious beliefs. So, and perhaps Spencer's quote here gives an indication of the oddity of the figures that I'm talking about. So Spencer is probably best known as a painter of religious scenes, described as visionary for his practice of imagining biblical stories in his native village of Cookham. In this paper, I'm going to look at how his unique religious beliefs can provide a lens through which we can understand the form of his paintings as well as the subject. This paper is largely informed by Spencer's writings on the subject of his religious beliefs and on how they direct his style of painting. So in one of his many pages of notes, he outlines an observation on what he calls the method of expression within art. He writes, "I notice often in an artist's work that the method of expression has not the same unique character as the essential meaning of the picture. The good picture is when the way, i.e. the particular character or sensibility evinced in the carrying out, is inseparable from the essential meaning and beauty of the picture. This utter oneness is particularly marked in Botticelli." The method of expression, synonymous with particular character or sensibility, seems to be akin to the formal style of the work, with Spencer suggesting that the meaning of the picture and the way it is conveyed should be unified. This is borne out in the dramatic variety of styles Spencer uses for different subject matter, with remarkable consistency. So, for example, all of his landscape paintings are made in the same hyperreal style, depicting flowers and trees in startling detail. The picture is of the real world, and it's presented with a level of realistic detail that gives priority to physical, tangible elements rather than an artist's impression of them. The portraits could be viewed in a similar way, as powerfully disturbing, were once considered obscene due to the detailed rendering of flesh, perhaps lending them to be considered naked women rather than nudes, without the mediating lens of an artist's interpretation. This hyperreal style is drastically at odds with the style in which he painted his religious pictures. As has been frequently noted, Spencer's early religious paintings of the teens and 1920s bear stylistic comparisons with the early Italian paintings he saw in books and at the National Gallery. And although Spencer mentions Botticelli in the quote I mentioned before in relation to style, formally it's Giotto who provides most significant comparisons. Spencer's figures in these early works are bulky and rounded, as we can see here, mirrored in the simplified elements of the landscape around them, facets which Keith Bell and others have remarked upon as being particularly Giotto-esque. These comparisons were also made by contemporary critics, with P.G. Conady remarking in The Observer in 1927 that, quote, "Mr. Spencer seems to me to stand as near to Giotto as it is possible for an artist of the present day." Now, these stylistic characteristics are not as unifying in grouping the religious paintings together as the hyperreal style of his landscapes and portraits, but a body of work that does share a similarly unifying and distinctive style are the paintings that Spencer began making in the mid-1930s for a scheme he called the Church House. And there's a section of the exhibition upstairs that deals with this. These are some of the paintings that he made. And you can see that they have a very distinctive style. It's figurative, but certainly not representational in the same way as his portraits. Spencer's desire to paint holistic schemes is connected to his interest in the early Italian painters, and he was particularly struck by Ruskin's book on Giotto's Arena Chapel in Padua, as is attested by his famous articulation, "What-o, Giotto," on receiving the Sand Memorial Chapel commission. He had been fortunate enough to find patrons in the Barons who had financed this, providing him with a house and stipend during its creation, as well as building the chapel itself. Spencer was understandably keen to recreate this success, but whereas his schemes for the Sandon Memorial Chapel had sprung from his war experiences, his new ambition was rooted in his desire to, quote, show the relations of religious life in the secular life, how that all is one religious life, end quote. And as he reflected in 1959, shortly before his death, after completing the Berkeley Chapel, I had a wish for whatever moved me, for that being moved, to come from one central and controlling idea. This central idea would direct all I wanted into its allotted place and order. There was a skeleton place in my mind of a church house, partly church and partly house. This wanted not only in order to show the whole of the spiritual life with its church happenings and its seemingly secular happenings of home life, but in order to show the unbroken and completely unified life of both. And when Spencer talks of secular happenings of home life, the domestic, home and marriage, these terms are frequently synonyms for a sexual life. Domestic scenes frequently feature the bedroom, and marriage implies union, physical as well as emotional, as I hope you might be able to see from some of this study for the Hilda Chapel, where he writes ingress pointing to one of the pictures. There's a note of stockings, so it's very explicitly drawing these things together. He continues, often when ordering life, there's a hiatus between one's religious life and secular life, and so in this church house, all life would come under one roof. The chancel was heaven, with the ceiling and top portion of the altarpiece would be Christ in the wilderness. Whatever other pictures there were in the chancel would be mainly the New Testament. The side walls of the nave were to be sides of houses in the street, and where doors occurred in the painting, there would be real doors entering these small houses. This gives a sense of the enormity of Spencer's architectural imaginings for a church house, and the paintings he made for this were equally all-encompassing, conceived of in three distinct but interlocking chains of events: the Pentecost, the baptism, and the marriage at Cana, all constituting the Last Judgment, as he wrote. So general scenes of the Last Judgment were grouped together by Spencer into what he called his adoration period, which includes the first church house painting, which we can see here, Sarah Tubb and the Heavenly Visitors, the Lovers, the Dustman, and A Village in Heaven. Spencer's notion of judgment was entirely positive, and he explicitly equates being judged with being liked by me, in his words, in which liking is a euphemism for sexually desiring. He wrote, quote, I have the wish to do a last judgment in which all things, circumstances, happenings, etc. are judged by means of expressing what I like in them. And so in the first six, including A Village in Heaven, one has a completely uncritical and forthright love and adoration expressed freely and in a sense indiscriminately. And in A Village in Heaven, this forthright love expressed freely is pictorially translated as an orgy on Woodbrook Common, as you can see here, noted by Duncan Robinson as a place popular locally for romantic assignations between villages. And you can see that in this case they're directed from the War Memorial by a disciple in white robes in the middle there. I don't know if that would work to show that. Anyway, you can see him. So people embrace each other in this picture. I just took a close-up detail so you can see some of the relations between the villages as they're happening there. They roll around on the ground, clasp the trees, almost a precursor to hippie love, free love counterculture of the 1960s. And the original title of this work was A Celebration of Love in Heaven, suggesting that Spencer felt this freedom to act upon sexual desire with multiple partners was not at odds with his religious beliefs, but was in fact a key part of heaven, God's domain. Similarly, his notion of marriage as both a religious and sexual state can be seen from his writings on the Dustman, this wonderful painting that we have upstairs. So he says, among other ways, I love a thing or person through their character, and this comes out strongly in what their calling may be. And loving the person, say the Dustman, I push on to the eternal, ever more infinite love of that Dustman. This infinite increase of whatever the Dustman is expressed and felt by me through imagining an infinite increase of love and desire feeling between the Dustman and his wife. Imagine them reaching a degree of passionate home life that they might not ordinarily have reached to. When we marry, our behaviour towards each other is different from when and before we are married. They in the Dustman painting are all super married, all of them infinitely married to all. They are all of them one as much as the carried Dustman is one with his wife who carries him. So writing around the time that these works were made, he explicitly noted, quote, "It is a mistake to suppose that because my recent pictures have a clear and emphatic relationship to sexual love, that they are for that reason neither spiritual nor religious." So before looking at how the style and the compositions of these paintings relate to Spencer's religious belief, it's worth tracing the genesis of this particular approach. Spencer was raised as a practicing Christian, and in early letters describing his bedroom to a friend, he reports that there are 2 text panels over his washstand, one stating, "The Lord is my help," and the other, "Pray without ceasing," which gives an indication of the sort of constant presence of Christianity in his upbringing. His brother Gilbert referred to the family's Christianity as low church, which Andrew Causey has interpreted as resulting in a resistance to the priesthood's mediatory role between individuals and God, and a rejection of the notion of an untouchable deity remote from the world. Spencer attended the Wesleyan Chapel, a branch of Protestant Christianity that placed an emphasis on one's personal relationship with God and individual religious experience, and he gives a vivid account of a particular service that he witnessed. This is quite a long quote. So I'll take some water first. In a blind sort of way, being entirely sanctified, as he puts in quote marks, was a way of expressing something they felt in themselves, and when they felt themselves to be so, they would go and flop down, God knows how, just under the auditorium. My eyes were well down, and I was trying to imagine what shape they were in on that sacred piece of ground that counted for coming to the Lord, just a patch of hard linoleum floor. It was only a small patch, room enough for one man only, and when I heard someone pass up by my pew and get down there, I felt it was a sort of spiritual apotheosis of a grocer, or whoever he was, taking place. It seemed to be the take-off place for their Methodist heaven. When I tried to imagine what it was like, he seemed, in my mind, to be Mr. So-and-so the grocer, yet he was intensely and passionately that. So the words he uses recalls the way he talks about the Dustman in this painting, foreshadowing the commingling of spirituality and sexuality as he talks of intensity and passion, the ecstasy of being entirely sanctified that can be seen on the faces of the figures within this painting, and the way the Dustman is being raised up, presumably towards heaven. Spencer's recollection is not just a retroactive application of his later philosophy onto childhood events. He had considered a marriage between spiritual and physical world early on, when at the Macedonian front in the First World War. He wrote to his sister, "Just as God in the natural flesh has given us natural desires for the means of perpetuating life, so in the spiritual world he has given us spiritual desires to uphold and keep alive forever his glorious traditions." And these two connected desires simply became further intertwined in the particular compositions of the church house. Spencer is unequivocal when outlining how the subject matter and the form in which it is expressed interact. He says, "The chief source of feeling in composing the paintings has been what is happening in them. What is the subject? What is the picture about? The consideration of that factor is what I always go to in the composing and realizing of the whole technique, the thing which determines everything, the forms, shapes, pattern, design, colors of whatever one may call the various apparent elements employed in making a picture. As I do a picture this way, it should be clear that what is called the subject matter of one of my pictures would be a matter of great moment to me. The chief technical consideration, the decision as to what I do, is the deepest and most highly technical part of my work. For instance, what I will call sexual stimulation has, in my opinion, been a strong element in teaching me how to draw and paint. In other words, a technical part. So it's clear that the form is derived from the subject, which returns us to the question of what knowledge of Spencer's intentions of the subject, the bringing together of the religious and the sexual within the church house, can offer to our reading of the distinctive forms of these works. One of the uniting characteristics of these works is the merging of one figure into another. In some, like Bathers at Odney and the scene from the Marriage at Cana, both from the Marriage of Cana cycle and both shown upstairs in the exhibition, the overlapping limbs and bodies can sometimes make it difficult to distinguish where one person begins and another ends. This could be read as a reflection of his belief in the interrelation and union of all things. As he wrote of the lovers, the Dustman, just put it back up here, All are intermarried with all. Polygamy, if one likes to describe it that way. And thus the marriage is infinite. And in a notebook dated 1937, 7 and 8, around the time these paintings were made, he wrote even, "A thing in a picture may be one thing, but in view of what it's doing as part of a composition, it is 100 things. This can be illustrated by holding up a picture of mine and seeing the extraordinary number of and completely different kinds of relationships existing between different parts of the picture." Aha. So in The Love of the Dustman, you can see that each element is connected with each other. In addition to this central couple of the dustman and his wife, you can see the wives of the labourers here and then their husbands behind them in the other side of the picture. The rubbish is connected to the dustman, obviously through his occupation being offered up to him. And actually Spencer also even notes that these kind of weird shelf-shaped yew bushes in the background are shaped that way to evoke shelves and the domestic, so bringing together the interior and the exterior. So the overlapping limbs and bodies of other works from the Adoration period, here's two more examples, A Village in Heaven, as we saw before, and Love Among Nations from the same sort of period, and also part of the church house. Their overlapping limbs and bodies could also reflect Spencer's expressed interest in the erotic art of Hindi temple Khajuraho. Sure, that's not spent right. And here's a picture of those sculptures where bodies similarly overlap and intertwine. And Spencer was interested in these, and he wrote to Hilda, his wife. They discussed these particular artworks. Spencer would have seen a resonance here with his own beliefs played out in form, as these sculptures symbolize the moksha, the reunion of two principles, the purusha, essence, and the prakriti, nature, so the spiritual and the physical. The dialogue between the spiritual and physical world can also be read into the bodily forms that Spencer employs to depict his characters. Their rounded limbs and cartoonish figures are clearly far away from the hyperreal style of his landscapes and portraits, which depict specific instances in the physical world, and instead tend towards an abstracted form of the body akin to Leger, for example. Yet they're also not fully abstract in the sense of being universal and non-representational, the type of forms that artists like Hepworth used to express a sense of spiritual and transcendental. And it's worth noting here the rare point of contact between Spencer and Hepworth. Both were in Hampstead in the 1930s, but in different artistic circles. I'm not going to say too much about it, but perhaps more pertinently to this subject, both had contact with Christian Science. So Hepworth had been raised with Christian Science, as Lucy will speak about a bit later, and her contact with the religion was renewed, and she continued throughout her life. Hilda Carline, Spencer's first wife and continued companion throughout his life, was a fervent Christian Science follower, and Spencer at times was persuaded towards her way of thinking. However, the Christian Science doctrine, which encouraged a rejection of the physical material world in favour of a focus on the spiritual and transcendental, frustrated Spencer, for whom the two were one united reality. Or that's certainly how he perceived that sort of dialogue. He wrote in the 1920s, quote, "In destroying the physical realness, you destroy the spiritual," showing the importance that he felt towards the physical world being manifest in his work. And he returned to the subject in his last year, in 1959, when obviously the rise of abstract art was something that he would have been very aware of, saying, quote, "The visible world is sour grapes to the artist who insists that a work where there has been some cognizance of the visible world is because of that fact inferior. The visible world is me, and any deliberate non-reference to it is to leave me out of it. The only way, then, to do a painting would be to employ some completely non-human instrument and means, and as all works of art are the special product of a human being, this would just be silly." As to why these figures, then, were not entirely faithful to the visible world, as other works he made were, he wrote in 1948, "From the time when, in early days, my father had complained of the strange appearance of the people in my pictures, I had also known why and how to ignorant people this would be unacceptable. For a long time after the Florentine period of painting, artists went on painting correctly and accurately, but a certain deadness and dullness occurred in their work, which was caused by the fact that they had lost sight of the reason for all this adherence to normal appearance. More recent painters made a serious mistake in concluding that the dullness they found in paintings where normal appearance had been adhered to was caused by that adherence. I say that was not the cause. The cause was that they no longer knew what that adherence was for, what its purpose was. As soon as blind adherence came, then vision, the spiritual faculty of sight, was gone. With me, the strain of trying to effect a recovery of this spiritual eyesight, not deliberately doing so, but finding it to be the case where and when one of these two experiences had taken the other over, where the spiritual eyesight has distorted normal appearance, it has been meaningful. Spencer's musings on the art of the past and its and his oscillation between abstraction and realism recall the aesthetic philosophy of Wilhelm Wöhringer, a German philosopher whose thesis on abstraction and empathy had been adopted by a London-based philosopher and critic T. Hume during Spencer's student days. Hume gave a lecture on the subject in London in 1914 and had been influential to many of Spencer's contemporaries, largely through his Tuesday night salons held at 67 Frith Street between 1911 and 1914, which Spencer is reported as attending on occasion. Wöhringer acknowledged the urge to empathy, which results in naturalistic depictions of the physical world, and the urge to abstraction as, and this is a quote from Wöhringer, antitheses which, in principle, are mutually exclusive. In actual fact, however, the history of art represents an increasing disputation between the two tendencies. He continues, whereas the precondition for the urge to empathy is a happy pantheistic relationship of confidence between man and the phenomena of the external world, the urge to abstraction is the outcome of a greater inner unrest inspired in man by the phenomena of the outside world. In a religious respect, it corresponds to a strongly transcendental tinge. Rather than mutually exclusive, Spencer seems to view these oppositions as a continuum, the church house works sitting closer to the pantheistic confidence between man and world, but, as he notes of his need to neglect his physical eye, still with an urge for abstraction sparked by this transcendental tinge. These peculiar human-shaped forms then combine elements of both realism and abstraction, elements that relate to the dichotomy Spencer aimed to combine with the subject as well as the form of his church house paintings, of both body and of soul. Thank you.
Thank you. The work heralded by W.H. Auden as the greatest poetic response to the First World War was not written by a seasoned scholar of literature, but by the trained artist David Jones. Jones had studied as an artist both prior to and after the First World War. In 1921, he converted to Roman Catholicism and joined Eric Gill's religious communities until 1925. Through these experiences, and influenced by the sacrament of the Eucharist, Jones came to appreciate all processes of sign-making as a religious act. His use of Christian allusions in his writings and artworks has been widely appreciated. However, he is best remembered for the aforementioned work, the allegedly secular poem In Parenthesis, first published in 1937. A recent exhibition was held at the Battle of Mametz Wood in Art at the National Museum of Wales in Cardiff recommended the secular interpretation. His epic poem, In Parenthesis, was begun in about 1929 and completed in 1937. As well as drawing upon the trauma of his experiences in the trenches, Jones incorporated references from mythology, history, and literature, including the Mabinogion. Literary critics have recognised it as a masterpiece of English-language modernist literature, and accordingly have given significant attention to the fictionalised poem, which mirrors Jones' own service during the war. Yet, for all the scholarly attention given to In Parenthesis, there is a crucial aspect that has never previously been considered at length. Jones's illustrations, rich with religious imagery dating from 1937. These enclose the poem with a frontispiece of a British soldier and a slain ram as tailpiece. The details surrounding the text, known as paratext, are, by their very nature, considered peripheral. According to Gerard Genet, this fringe is always the conveyor of a commentary that is authorial or more or less legitimated by the author. While included in the first edition of In Parenthesis, subsequent editions frequently omitted the illustrations to Jones' disapproval. Art historical scholarship has fleetingly touched upon the frontispiece and tailpiece as artworks in their own right. I argue, however, that they have crucial significance and that a reconciliation of the written word and illustrations uncovers another dimension to Jones's complex sign-making. The title refers most obviously to Jones's description in the preface of a war as being a parenthesis. However, Jones had initially envisioned In Parenthesis as a series of artworks or prints with short text accompaniments. He told the art collector H.S. Eade in 1936 that he had started out with, quote, the idea of doing a lot of illustrations with long captions of a sort. Jones qualified the parenthesis carefully in the preface, indicating a range of interpretations. This writing is called In Parenthesis because I have written it in a kind of space between. I don't know between quite what, but as you turn aside to do something, and because for us amateur soldiers, and especially for the writer, who is not only amateur, but grotesquely incompetent, a knocker over of piles, a parade's despair, the war itself was a parenthesis. How glad we thought we were to step outside its brackets at the end of 18, and because our curious type of existence here is altogether in parenthesis. At least 4 varieties of parenthesis are evident: the space between, the war, our existence, and Jones himself as grammatically enacted. The concept of parenthesis also has distinct relationship with beginnings and endings. These two artworks are literally the parentheses to the poem. These works also carry ecclesial implications, relate to the beginnings and endings of Christian doctrine of salvation, otherwise known as atonement or soteriology, and the last things, which is apocalypse or eschatology. By reconciling the text and paratext, it is possible to begin reconceiving In Parenthesis as an interdisciplinary religious work of art. I will first elaborate on Jones's war service before addressing each illustration and exploring the implications of its religious iconography. The poem's part biographical, part fictitious narrative closely follows a battalion over the course of 7 months, from December 1915 to July 1916, as they train and leave Britain for the trenches, before culminating at the Somme as they fight in the Battle of Mametz Wood. Jones was the only member of the High Modernist writers, which included Joyce, Ezra Pound and Eliot, to actually fight in World War I. He had enlisted in January 1915 with the Royal Welsh Fusiliers in accordance with his North Walian heritage, and he became the longest serving of any war poet by the time he was demobbed. He served in total 117 weeks at the throne. Jones emphasised that In Parenthesis was not about the war, but about a war, writing that he, quote, did not intend this as a war book. It happens to be concerned with war. The poem transcends this First World War setting by drawing upon historical, literary and scriptural allusions, something that was omitted from the earlier exhibition description, to construct a rich and densely composed text. Jones made the sketch for this frontispiece in preparation for an unfulfilled etching, but was anticipated to be one of many that would adorn the book. So it's a central figure. He kind of adopts a kind of cruciform pose, and he obviously alludes to Christ on the cross. It's kind of, you see fragments of his clothing around him, and again his awkward kind of shape. The elbows are outright. So
Is he
Yes, so there's the barbed wire then curl around his feet. So again, we can think about that. And then to the left and right, we see further soldiers carrying out fatigue duties. And again, they evoke the carrying of a cross. Above his shoulders, there are these two tree forms that again reference the crosses at Calvary. So together they indicate the three crosses of Calvary. So all in all, they're clear allusions to the crucifixion of Jesus. The tailpiece also carries strong religious references. A horned ram has been wounded with Roman weighted pilum. The landscape is otherwise void of life. The animal's feet and crown are entangled by wire, alluding to a ram caught in the thicket, which is substituted for the sacrifice of Isaac in Genesis 22:13. In the book, the tailpiece is preceded by 6 biblical quotations printed in block letters. Significantly, amongst the scriptural references are several indicating sacrificial roles in the Hebrew Bible. Here we have the scapegoat of Leviticus 16, the man of sorrows or the suffering servant from Isaiah, and the Passover lamb of Exodus. The former, the scapegoat, being the predominant interpretation of the image. The scapegoat was sent into the wilderness with the sins of the world. Ostensibly, both the frontispiece and tailpiece are images of sacrifice, as current scholarship recognises, supporting the suggestion by Roland Boissou that the poem sits between images of Old and New Testament sacrifice. The conflation of the soldier with the sacrifice of Jesus, as suggested in the frontispiece, is a common trope of First World War writing. However, by considering the religious content more seriously, we see that Jones's religious references go beyond mere trope. This offers a more nuanced understanding reflective of Jones' religious belief, and it becomes apparent that Jones eschews the cliché. The cross and the scapegoat are intricately involved with respective Christian and Jewish doctrines of salvation. These narratives explain the means by which the faithful are reconciled to God and how the sins of the world are accounted for. While there are many disputes and no official line on the interpretation of the crucifixion, Catholic Christology accepts that Jesus' crucifixion was the culmination of a sacrificial tradition and the great sacrificial act. As Thomas R. Whitaker recognises, and I quote, patristic writers who regarded pagan as well as Old Testament figures as anticipations of Christian revelation meant much to David Jones. Jones recognised Jesus' sacrifice as the perfect sacrifice, able to accomplish that which the animal sacrifices in Hebrew scripture were only able to intimate and not achieve. The work of the philosopher theologian Jacques Maritain and the French Jesuit Maurice Delatar had influenced him. Jones acknowledged the latter as being, quote, my theologian. Delatar's Mystery of Faith and Human Opinion Contrasted and Defended presented extensive work on the tradition of sacrifice and took sacrifice to be of paramount importance for his Roman Catholic sacramental theology. Jones uses frontispiece and tailpiece to frame the poem with images of sacred victims denoting sacrificial atonement, and thus presents the tradition of necessary sacrifice in Scripture. War shares this tradition of sacrifice in the secular sense. However, Jones suggested this had changed during the war. He later claimed, quote, all our tradition is of war. But around the period of 1916, where the poem ends, Jones identified a transition as the heroic sensibilities of the past were overtaken by the mechanised and inhumane modern means of warfare. It was, as he would later call it, the turn of civilization, a situation where Jesus is easy to miss. The traditional notion of a heroic and romanticised battle of history was upended by the mechanised warfare of the First World War. Chivalric sacrifice was converted into a statistic. It became a meaningless death. According to Jones, the war became something harsher with the summer of 1916 being a watershed. Quote, from July 1916, things hardened into a more relentless, mechanical affair, took on a more sinister aspect, the wholesale slaughter of the later years, the conscripted levies filling the gaps in every file of four, not for bottom out of the intimate, continuing domestic life of small contingents of men. Consequently, the frontispiece and its fractured form indicate a couplet of traditions and sacrifices, those of Christianity and war, thrown into disarray. The Old Testament sacrifice anticipates the New Testament sacrifice, itself reenacted in the Eucharist, while historic sacrifice of war foretold the present. Jones was emphasising continuity between past and present to understand and order contemporary experience, even as those same traditions were unravelling. The tailpiece has multiple allusions to scripture aside from sacrificial tradition. It is rarely mentioned in scholarship that the sketch is preceded with those 6 scriptural references. The first of these is from the last book of the Bible, the Apocalypse of St. John, or the Book of Revelation. The passage from chapter 5, verse 6, was initially inscribed in Jones' own hand across the bottom of the drawing, giving the tailpiece an overt and specific biblical reference. So if you look very carefully here, just see a small amount of his writing. The last book of the Bible and the tailpiece both signify endings, and Jones has drawn obvious parallels between the two. This reference leads us to uncover other motifs of the apocalypse, such as the shooting or falling stars in Revelation 6:13. The Latin text, "Et vidi agnum stantem taquam occasum," essentially translates, "And I saw the lamb standing as though slain." Here, the animal is prescribed another identity. It is also the Lamb of the Apocalypse and the Agnus Dei. It becomes another reference to the sacrifice of Jesus, as in the Apocalypse, the Lamb is the dominant title for Jesus, where it occurs 29 times. Therefore, the sacrifice of Jesus encloses the poem with a frontispiece and tailpiece. The salvation gained by Jesus' sacrifice is realised in the sacramental blood of the Eucharist. The book of Revelation specifies that Jesus washed us from our sins in his own blood. If we accept the lamb as signifying Jesus, then the sacrificial blood is of special interest here, ejecting from the wound. So if you see, it reoccurs throughout the preparatory sketches Jones made. It's worth returning to Delatar here to address the emerging Eucharistic dimension. Jones viewed the Holy Eucharist instituted by Christ at the Last Supper as the most profound instance of sign-making, one that all others, secular or religious, are indebted to. Delatar identified the Last Supper and the Crucifixion as being part of the same event. They form the, quote, arc of our salvation. Delatar proposed that the supper pre-enacts the crucifixion, while every subsequent recital of the Eucharist re-enacts both the supper and the crucifixion, and so is always an act of sacrifice. Thus, the tradition of redemptive sacrifice from the Old Testament to the New and into the present day is evoked. Let's remember the Last Supper and crucifixion are part of the same whole. According to Delatar, in the oblation of the Last Supper, Jesus put himself, quote, symbolically in the state of victim. The root of victim is the Latin victima, meaning a living sacrifice offered up to a deity. When Jones titled this work The Victim in a 1944 exhibition, it was as a symbol not of a sacrifice, but the sacrifice of Jesus. Accepting this to be an image of Jesus, as already argued, leads us then to identify Pilum as being Longinus' lance, the spear of destiny. Jones has used these complementary aspects of the Last Supper and Eucharist with the crucifixion across the space of the frontispiece and tailpiece. This encloses the world of the poem, an autobiographical world, with the crucifixion, and foreshadows Jones' concept of the crucifixion as axis mundi, which he realised later in his epic poem, The Anathemata. The centrality of crucifixion goes further. The respective depictions of a cross and a lamb in the frontispiece and tailpiece are literally bound together as a book. This intimates the time when Christianity was a prescribed religion under the Romans, when the crucifixion was represented symbolically by the Lamb of Christ juxtaposed with a cross. Jones symbolically manifests the crucifixion as the core of in parenthesis via these two images. Having identified allusions to a sacrificial tradition, the crucifixion and the Lamb of God, there's a final concern I wish to address. The crucifixion has historically been linked with ideas of temporal or epochal transition, and specifically the New Covenant that replaces Old Mosaic law. Yet, according to Roman Catholic doctrine, the crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension of Christ signifies the transition to the age of the Church, which is the equivalent to the millennium of the Book of Revelation. The millennium being a paradise, a 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth. Likewise, the Lamb of the Apocalypse, although representing the first coming of Jesus, connotes the last epoch. Consequently, the frontispiece signifies a beginning, an interpretation given further evidence by the allusion to the nativity and the star situated above the ruined farmhouse. So back here you have a ruined farmhouse, and then the star above. Whilst the tailpiece is suggesting the ending as understood within the religion. Although Jones indicated the war itself was a parenthesis, but also indicated the end of the age, the parenthesis was also, quote, a space in between, I don't know quite what. This indeterminate aspect is also the beginning of the Christian world and the end of the age. The Book of Revelation and Apocalypse are used within the poem to depict the Great War as a moment of transition and, quote, the locus of a definitive civilizational break. Jones indicates the apocalypse and the end of the millennial age of the Church in Part 7, entitled The 5 Unmistakable Marks. He writes, quote, the last minute drums its taut millennium out. In the fullness of time, the world falls apart. He continues, riders on pale horses loosed and bars are irreparably broken. He indicates the horsemen of the apocalypse at the opening of the 7 seals in the Book of Revelation. The 7 seals is a structure mirrored in the 7 parts of in parenthesis. This gloom is more acute when we factor Jones' conception of history. In the 1930s, he was familiarised with Oswald Spengler's The Decline and Fall of Western Civilization. It was Spengler's attempt to present a great history of the world. Spengler's pessimistic argument of civilizational lateness and prophesied decline of Western civilization appealed to Jones, who wrote in 1942 how Spengler seemed to encapsulate many of his thoughts over the last 2 decades. It was a concept that pervades much of Jones' later work. However, he rejected Spengler's fatalism and sought hope among the ruins. Jones clung to Book of Revelation's promise that following tribulation comes restored creation. Thus we see the temporal concern of the frontispiece and tailpiece are actually tied into the ideas of hope denoted by Christ and the doctrine of salvation. In conclusion, we can see that Christian concerns of a prose poem are not just complemented, but expanded in the frontispiece and tailpiece. Thomas Dilworth previously identified the symmetrical spatial structure within the text. This is also achieved in the coupling of the frontispiece and tailpiece, which emphasise the centrality of Jesus. A secular reading that gives equal weight to religious elements as to other literary references is an anachronistic projection of contemporary values and culture. Jones's allusions to Christianity differ to other allusions as they are rooted in his sincere belief. His paratextual commentaries guide the reader towards Christian references and orientate towards Christian themes of particular importance to the author, indicating his intention for the work. By recognising the importance of this content, it is possible to appreciate in parenthesis as a single work incorporating text and images, rather than a text with images. This presents us with a work concerned with tradition and underpinned by religious belief. These themes provide an explanatory framework for the war. They engender hope and they offer solidarity in history. Thank you.
Okay, so we've got a few minutes now for discussion and questions. I think Eleanor and Tom both gave us some close readings, some close iconographical readings of the images that you both showed. And also, I think you both brought up how the artist's writing and text can guide interpretation of those works as well. I can see questions already, and as we've got a short amount of time, I'm going to go straight to one of them over there.
This is very quick, actually. I am a practicing Roman Catholic, and I had heard of that book, and I'd seen it, but that really brought it to life for me. So thanks very much for that.
Thank you.
Did everyone hear the question? Just saying, this gentleman's a practicing Roman Catholic, and that really brought this to life.
I was just saying, your explanation of it just brought it to life. You know, I was aware of it, but I didn't really understand what it was about. I mean, I knew it was like a Welsh connection.
Yeah, same don't really. Of course, as a piece of high modernist literature, you don't really understand what it's about until about fourth or fifth reading with commentary anyway. So.
It's quite good going. 4 or 5 readings. So it's quite good going if you understand it after 4 or 5 readings.
Well, exactly. I certainly didn't understand it in my 20s.
Rachel.
Hi, thanks very much. I really enjoyed that. It's really fascinating. And I wondered how much of this is picking up themes that are already there in Sigrid Sassoon and Wilfred Owen and some of the earlier poets, because this is what he starts this in 29, goes through into the 30s. Is there that sort of sense that that's feeding into it as well?
Jones, when he came to write the book, he had read a number of examples of poetic responses to the war, and he was kind of like very dismissive of them, and he apparently had just finished reading a number of books by 29, and then he's kind of like, I can do better than this, and started his own attempt. Saying about kind of the trope of Christ and the soldier, and conflating the two. When that kind of frequently occurs, it's about the sacrifice, and in theology there's the idea of hypostatic union. So it's Christ being both divine and human. In many of the poems in the First World War, they turn Christ into a very human figure with who then the soldier can be identified with. The divine transcendent aspect is reduced or dismissed. Jones is very, very at odds with that. He rarely would speak about the crucifixion, but the few reported occasions when he did speak about the crucifixion, he almost broke down into tears. He believed very much in the sanctity of this. So on one hand, he was aware of many of the preceding works, but he didn't necessarily see eye to eye with them, so to speak.
Conversation.
Yeah.
There's a question here from this lady.
Yes, it's great to have the example of some poetry, and you brought to our attention this fact that this particular work had secular interpretations, and now that you can have a more sacred interpretation. Of course, that was a theme that Sam explained to us as being a feature of art history as well, art commentary. So I wonder if you, Tom, you could reflect on our own interpretation of modernist poetry, because we come to that and often think, oh, it's very modernist and secular, but a second reading, we really often realise it's profoundly spiritual and religious.
Yes. There are a number of kind of Roman Catholicism became very, dare I say, trendy in the 20s in response to the First World War. And a number of high modernists actually began flirting with Roman Catholicism, and again, they're rich with references to religion, to Christianity, to sacrament, and with different, again, it's case-by-case basis. Sometimes they're recognising, given a certain weight, and sometimes they're pulled back. But again, for the very nature of an allusion, it is, and it's not. So it's always resisting that meaning. I think with Jones, because he was an artist as well, he approaches it from a very different angle to someone like Eliot, or he's a slightly kind of curious figure, and I think yes.
So I suppose my question is, it's sort of, there was a denial of the fact, or has been, I think, for what my perception is, that these modernist works are also spiritual, because we're so keen to embrace the modern modernist.
What are we talking about?
Well, poetry and art.
Well, let's see if Tom can try and answer that one.
Are you talking about First World War poetry?
Well, and also just, Eliot and others that we might read, who we've read as modernist poets, and we tend to have not always reflected on the fact that they also are also religious.
Could I just also ask Eleanor about Spencer and poetry, because that's something that comes out in the exhibition and in the words that you've used in the audio guide as well, because I think there's an interesting kind of connection here between your papers, and just thinking about Spencer's, not as a poet in the same way, but his response to poetry and the use of poetics in his work.
Yes, I guess what I sort of thought particularly as a connection in terms of language more broadly is that also with these church house paintings, they were dismissed by a lot of the contemporary critics, or the contemporary reception of them wasn't very good because they were seen as too overtly sexual. And one of the quotes that I mentioned here, he said he did go to great pains to write about them in a spiritual way. He felt that they were misunderstood as being sort of modernist without a kind of religious element, when actually that was exactly the thing that he was trying to do. So I guess one of the things that I found out about Spencer when I started researching for the show was how much he wrote. And he wrote so much. There's over 1 million words of his writing in the Tate archive, and the family have boxes and boxes of more of that. And it's not poetry as such, but it is kind of, I guess it could be considered as modernist stream of consciousness, often with very little punctuation and really more philosophy than anything else. But
there are some of those great papers in the Tate Archive by Spencer where he starts out with a sharp pencil, and about 6 or 7 pages later it's just this stub. And it's,
But it's interesting, philosophy was such a rich theme in both of your papers, showing that both Jones and Spencer were drawing on kind of very contemporary, a contemporary philosophical European tradition as well, Warringer, Hume, you were talking about Spengler as well, and I think that's kind of an interesting, their kind of intervention within philosophical debates of that moment as well, and I just thought that came out very strongly through listening to both of your papers.
I think it ties back to what you were saying really, that Spencer, again, whilst he's been seen in later 20th century as this sort of rogue eccentric out on his own, was going to these salons and was part of a not just artistic but philosophical and often political as well. I mean, he signed up to the suffrage movement very early on as well, and I guess that this was happening with writers and artists a lot. It was a kind of cultural connections across medium.
And again, David Jones, Spencer in 1921 he visited Eric Gill at Ditchlings.
There's a question at the lady at the back.
Firstly, staff person, I really love the exhibition. It's really opened up Spencer for me. And I think he was from Wesleyan tradition.
Yeah.
But he feels like the gentleman there, practicing Catholic. He feels very Catholic. It's very Trinitarian, very incarnational is his work. And I just wonder how it was. And with this morning we kind of talked about mystics. And of course, all religions have a long history of mystics. It's not just in the modernist period. And he feels very much in that kind of in that vein, a mystic himself. How were his religious works received? Because he obviously made a living through landscapes and portraits. But what did people make of his religious works at the time?
So it's a really interesting question, and the answer is that it kind of changed throughout the time. So his early religious works, things like Zacharias and Elizabeth, you know, they went down really well in the teens. So the works that kind of had an allusion to Giotto and the early Italian painters were the painting that Sarah had in her paper, John Donne Coming Into Heaven. You know, that was selected by Clive Bell for the second post-impressionist exhibition. So when Spencer was just out of university, he was already building quite a big name for himself and really having quite a strong career. Obviously, one of the greatest works which is on permanent display at the Tate in London is The Resurrection, so another religious work which was bought by the Tate on the 1927 show at the Goupil Gallery. So his religious works were received really, really well. What was received less well was when he actually started putting into his religious works his particular religious beliefs that did have this synthesis of sexuality brought into them. And there's a sort of documented letter exchange with his dealer, Dudley Tooth, in the 30s, where he's kind of complaining about having to do all the landscapes to make money. And he said, why can't you sell some of my religious paintings? And Dudley says, it's not your religious paintings that's the problem, it's all the sex that you put in them. If you could do the religious... And for Spencer, that's a nonsensical request, because he doesn't see the two things as being separable at all. So that's where he starts having the problem. So The Love is the Dustman, which featured very heavily in my presentation because I think it's so amazing, and because he writes so well about it. And you might have heard, if you've seen upstairs, he talks about the Trinity, in that the Trinity of the teapot, the jam sandwich and the rubbish, I can't remember what the other thing is. But that was rejected from the Royal Academy because although actually in some respects it's quite sort of traditional in its religious format and its composition, actually the sort of sexual element to it was considered to be a bit too racy, and the peculiar forms that he used, which I tried to sort of draw out why he chose those in my paper. But at the time people just thought he was painting badly, basically.
What about bodily erotics and Jones' work? It's not something that gets talked about that much, but especially in relation to Maritain and Catholic theology.
Yes. Well, Imprempsis in particular actually has a strong use of the body and references to the body. Actually, the 6 scriptural references, 2 of which are from the Song of Songs or the Song of Solomon, which some of you... yes.
Sex. It's a song about really good sex.
I didn't say it. But it gets read frequently as referring to the bride as being the church. So there's always this kind of reference to the bride. The bride of Christ is the church, and so when you have an amillennial viewpoint, so the age of the church, you have the central figure of the bride, the papal authority, all this kind of brought up into it. So there's this definite kind of body aspect there, but but in parenthesis in particular, again, the frontispiece has the nude soldier, and his genitals often get referred to as being alike to artillery, but very small artillery. But throughout it, there comes this element of the body being destroyed and broken down and disintegrating, and the main character in it is Ball. So then there's private leg and Ball, and so again it's referencing the bodily aspect, especially around genitalia. And then when the poem begins to culminate, you have the death coming along, and it talks about death almost being raping. So again, it's this, the role the body plays in parenthesis does carry a lot of connotations. Yes.
Do we have time for one more question? I saw that gentleman first.
It's not a question, it's just a comment. How appalling that book jacket is.
Could you say that again? Sorry, I missed the...
David Jones is some of the most subtle, nuanced, beautiful inscriptions of the 20th century.
Yes.
And those are 2 great clothing boots. Anyway, it's my comment.
The book cover.
I think just maybe one more.
Could I just make a very quick point or whatever? I think it's worth saying that in the early 20s that Spencer very much veered towards Catholicism, all the
Yes.
letters to Desmond Chute that
Yes.
Paul Gough has collected, and then he almost seemed to cut Desmond Chute off, like he sort of rejected this Catholicism as if he felt he moved too close towards it.
Well,
And then he sort of had this idea, didn't he, that he'd like to have a religion where he could have a dozen wives and he could be a father to each family. That's what,
Yeah, I mean, he did. His beliefs evolved, I guess is the way to say it. But actually, what's interesting, I guess, just to perhaps sort of tie the two things together, is how war played a part in the evolution of those beliefs. So he wrote a lot to Chute during the war and found great comfort in Chute's Catholicism through that, but then also wrote to him after the war that he felt that the war had quite unmanned him and that actually he'd found himself questioning his Christian beliefs because of his experiences in the war. And some people, including Spencer, sort of slightly alludes to this, that because of what he saw in the war and all the death, when he came back, he wanted to just celebrate life, and joy and sex was part of that for him, and that's sort of a driving force for that evolution, I guess, of bringing the two things together.
Well, Desmond Chute, because he after the war, he joined Eric Gill's community at Ditchling, so he became a very close friend to David Jones, actually, there, and he ended up moving out. He became ordained and ended up living in Italy, but he with kind of Spencer's kind of flirtation with Catholicism, again, it's the kind of story about it being too much authority for him, and he couldn't bear that.
Great. Well, thank you to you both for bringing out such fascinating connections. I think we've got 15 minutes for a quick break, and then we'll be back for our last session. But please join me in thanking Eleanor and Tom.